The conference room smelled sharply of fresh brewed coffee, its rich aroma cutting through a tension so thick it seemed to coat the glass walls and brushed steel fixtures. You could practically taste the anxiety in the air, the kind that settles in right before someone's career gets gutted in front of their peers. At the head of the table, Rachel Montgomery was the picture of corporate perfection. Her Armani suit pressed to surgical crispness, her hair arranged in a way that screamed executive, not a strand out of place. She clicked forward on the remote, revealing a slide deck blaring strategic leadership evolution in bold, sanitized font. I watched, numb in my $1,000 leather chair, as the pieces fell into place. The script was obvious. Rachel was about to make an example out of me, publicly, efficiently. I'm Andrew Hoffman, 52 years old, with the kind of mileage that comes from 3 decades in cybersecurity trenches. I'd seen this corporate derailment coming for half a year. Hell, I'd practically read it in the tea leaves the day Rachel was named CEO back in January 2024. She arrived on a wind of prestige, Stanford MBA, a Rolodex fattened by her father William Montgomery's boardroom connections, and a command of corporate buzzwords that could fill a Harvard Business Review. But beneath the jargon, Rachel had no taste for the work itself, the slow, grinding business of keeping the country's most vital systems secure. Her first act as CEO, a grand speech about transforming legacy operational paradigms in defense contracting. That's the sort of phrase that tells a room full of lifers, people who'd spent decades keeping classified networks, invisible to foreign adversaries, that their days were numbered. Meridian Defense Solutions was no garage startup. We had an ironclad reputation, decades of government trust, and $53 million a year in contracts with the NSA, Department of Defense, and Homeland Security. Our job wasn't to build the next app or chase VC funding. We kept Chinese hackers from blacking out the Northeast grid, and we made sure Iranian cyber units couldn't slip malware into the water treatment plants of major cities. Back in 2019, a breach nearly killed Meridian. I rebuilt our threat analysis platform from the ground up, line by line. My team and I didn't just update antivirus definitions. We spent years designing, implementing, and refining a defense that actually stood up to the real world's relentless, evolving threats. Rachel, though, had no patience for that side of things. Her ambitions were laser-focused on headlines and quarterly reports, on getting her name in Forbes, on prepping Meridian for an IPO that would cement her as the next young visionary to disrupt an old-guard defense contractor. She wanted the kind of profile that impresses investors and tech journalists, not the kind that wins quiet thanks from field officers whose lives depend on our firewall holding. Meanwhile, my own life was stuck in high-stakes limbo. My divorce settlement had saddled me with tuition for my son Jake, $31,000 a year at Virginia Tech, with his senior year starting in August. If I lost my job at 52, I'd be staring down 6 months, maybe longer, of job hunting, a process made doubly hard by the need for a sponsor to transfer my top-secret clearance. My $185,000 salary was standard for this line of work in D.C., but outside the Beltway or Silicon Valley, it was a rare find. The reality was simple. At my age, with my obligations, I couldn't afford to be expendable. The warning signs began blinking red in February. Rachel started holding capability assessments for my division, but the invitations never reached me. I found out about them from Alex Turner, a guy I'd mentored from his first day, just chatting during a code review. I confronted Rachel, asking why I was being sidelined from my own team's evaluations. She gave me that CEO smile, all teeth and zero warmth, and delivered a line about wanting fresh approaches to threat mitigation. It was corporate speak for "you're obsolete." But cybersecurity isn't advertising. And fresh ideas don't keep Russian botnets at bay. You can't out-innovate a zero-day exploit with a motivational poster. Things deteriorated fast. My name vanished from the schedule for Pentagon briefings that I'd led for years. Suddenly, new faces, kids barely out of grad school, were being trotted out for client presentations. Rachel would nod along politely as I explained our new zero-day mitigation strategy, then pivot to her 26-year-old niece, Brooke Chambers, for perspective on integrating artificial intelligence paradigms. Brooke, less than a year out of USC with a communications degree. She'd been at Meridian all of 73 days before Rachel named her Chief Innovation Officer, a title that, in our world, should have meant battle scars from 1,000 cyber skirmishes, not a knack for Instagram filters. Brooke's cybersecurity experience began and ended with managing her sorority's social media, and calling IT when she forgot her Wi-Fi password. But optics mattered more than results now. Brooke was young, camera-ready, and fit Rachel's vision of agile innovation, the kind of narrative that played in glossy boardroom presentations and Pentagon PR, not in the war rooms where real decisions were made. Somehow, this was all it took to give her a seat at the table with generals and career defense officials who'd been fending off state-sponsored hackers since before the word cyber even existed. By May, it all came to a head. The annual DoD Threat Assessment Review was looming on June 18th, a date circled in red on every calendar in the office. This wasn't just some annual check-in. It was a crucible. Pentagon auditors and generals would tear through our work, questioning every line of code, every security protocol, every contingency plan. The outcome would determine if we kept or lost a $34 million contract. For 4 years, I'd been the one leading these reviews, translating technical jargon into actionable intelligence for the highest echelons of military command, fielding questions that could make or break careers. This year, Rachel scheduled the prep meetings and I didn't even know they were happening until I saw the conference rooms booked. I marched to her corner office, an entire floor above mine, with a panoramic view of the Potomac and a door that always seemed to close just as I arrived. When I asked what was going on, she delivered her decision with chilling calm. It's part of our generational leadership transition. Brooke, she said, would be presenting the technical overview this year. You've documented everything so well, knowledge transfer should be seamless. Seamless. As if the years I'd spent architecting our security systems could be distilled into a few SharePoint folders and a handoff email. I tried to explain. Brooke had never written a line of code, let alone navigated a Pentagon Q&A. The generals weren't interested in buzzwords or slick PowerPoints. They'd want specifics, NIST compliance, detailed threat vectors, hard data on how our platforms integrate with classified systems spread across air-gapped networks. You can't bluff your way through a technical grilling with synergy and AI paradigms. Defense contracting isn't a software demo for retail clients. It's a battlefield. And the enemy is always watching, always adapting. But Rachel didn't want to hear it. She needed her story of disruption, her narrative of a young visionary leader upending the old guard. She wanted the board to see Meridian as a company reborn, led by new blood, ready for Wall Street, no matter the cost to the mission. And as I sat there in that conference room, feeling every eye on me, I realized that in this new Meridian, the truth didn't matter. Optics did. And I was about to be sacrificed on the altar of progress. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair, a gesture that put just enough distance between us to make her authority clear. Her gaze swept over me, clinical, as if I were a relic from a prior era. Something functional but fundamentally obsolete. A machine running outdated firmware. Andrew, I appreciate your experience, but we need to demonstrate next-gen thinking to the new crowd in government procurement, she said, each syllable precise. Next-gen thinking. The phrase echoed in my mind like a slogan from a tech conference. All polish and no substance. I let my eyes drift to the framed photo on the wall, a group shot from last year's Pentagon Cybersecurity Review Board. The youngest member had just turned 45. On paper, the board boasted a collective 22 years of military and civilian security experience. But in reality, their loyalty was to continuity, not disruption. Experience was their currency, not innovation. They didn't want radical new ideas. They wanted assurance that the infrastructure would hold steady when Beijing decided to launch a synchronized attack at 3 a.m., exploiting every conceivable digital backdoor. I spent the afternoon wrestling with the weight of that contradiction. Finally, after months of procrastination, I dialed Norman Price. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for my call. Norman was a retired Navy commander with a mind like a lockbox. The kind of person who actually understood the labyrinth of federal contracts, unlike Rachel's latest crop of consultants, who wielded their Ivy League MBAs like badges, but couldn't distinguish between restructuring a business and navigating the Byzantine world of government procurement. Norman's office was as organized as a command center, every document in its place. Norman, I need to review the key personnel requirements in our DoD contracts, I said, lowering myself into the stiff chair across from his desk. Specifically the continuity requirements. I want to know exactly where we stand if there's a change in leadership. Norman nodded, his fingers already flying over the keyboard. He scrolled through a series of digital folders, each labeled with dates and contract numbers, finally landing on the amendments from our 2020 recertification. That year had been a turning point for us. After the catastrophic data breach of 2019, a breach that nearly put us out of business, the Pentagon had imposed a new layer of scrutiny. Every role deemed critical to contract performance now had to be named explicitly, in black and white. No more anonymous teams, no more last-minute substitutions. If you wanted to swap out the architect of a classified system, you had to notify DoD in advance and submit the candidate for review, background check, and clearance validation. Here's the section you're looking for, Norman said, highlighting a dense paragraph of legalese. FAR 52.2191 stipulates you need to give 180 days notice if you plan to change any designated key personnel. Early removal triggers a contract review, unless the new person has identical qualifications and clearance. He paused, glancing at the list. My name was there, marked as key personnel on 4 contracts with a combined annual value of $47 million. Rachel, in all her zeal for modernization, didn't even seem to realize these designations existed, or what they meant for the company's operational stability. What's the timeline for DoD to approve personnel changes? I asked, already bracing myself for the answer. Norman squinted at the screen. Best case scenario, you're looking at 120 days for a capability assessment. Realistically, if they have any doubts, or if recent performance is under review, it can drag out for 6 to 9 months. He fixed me with a shrewd look, the kind that comes from decades of reading between the lines. Why the sudden interest in personnel regs, Andrew? Is there something you're not telling me? I forced a casual shrug, just making sure any leadership transition is as smooth as possible. That evening, I found myself hunched over the kitchen table in my Alexandria townhouse, surrounded by half-empty mugs and printouts covered in annotated notes. I was calculating the cost of corporate warfare line by line. Rachel wanted me out, preferably before the upcoming Pentagon review in June, but federal regulations had a different timeline in mind. If she fired me without DoD's blessing, every contract where I was listed as key personnel would immediately be frozen pending a full review. 9 months without revenue would cripple Meridian Defense, maybe irreparably. The stakes weren't just personal. They were existential for the company. Over the weekend, I started building my own insurance policy, a comprehensive archive of 8 years' worth of architecture designs, threat detection protocols, security frameworks, and incident logs. Every algorithm, every line of code bore my digital signature, cryptographic proof of authorship and clearance. The neural network that had become our flagship threat mitigation tool was rooted in my own security clearances. The chain of trust for every classified system traced back to my credentials. Rachel might want to sweep out the old guard, but she was about to learn why we'd written the contracts with such meticulous attention to continuity. The date for the Pentagon review was set, June 18th, 8 a.m. sharp. Rachel had been assuring the board for weeks that Brooks' new leadership would prove Meridian Defense was a forward-thinking contractor, agile enough to meet the evolving needs of national security. I hadn't been invited to a single prep meeting, all of which had kicked off in May. My exclusion was deliberate, signaling a new regime, but I knew better than to take it personally. These games were as old as bureaucracy itself. On May 15th, Pete Sullivan, our senior outside consultant and perennial survivor of defense industry shakeups, dropped by my office. Pete had been in the business since the Bush administration, and he carried the battle scars to prove it. He knew exactly what was at stake when you were defending the kind of classified networks that couldn't afford failure. Heard from a reliable source that DoD is sending in the big guns next month, Pete said, settling into the guest chair and lowering his voice. General Morrison, straight from Cyber Command. Deputy Director Walsh from NSA. Procurement chiefs from 3 different service branches. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. When that level of brass convened, it was never just a routine audit. What are they after? I asked, though deep down I already had my suspicions. Full spectrum review. They want an exhaustive walkthrough of our threat analysis platform, especially the machine learning modules you engineered after the Iranian supply chain breach last September. The Iranian breach. 6 months ago, a team of state-backed hackers in Tehran had tried to infiltrate DoD logistics by slipping compromised firmware into a routine shipment. Our system had flagged the anomaly in under 60 seconds, initiated a lockdown sequence, and alerted Pentagon security before the attackers could even access the outer layers of the network. That incident had single-handedly secured our reputation and our continued stream of contracts. But the core algorithms that enabled our real-time detection, those were my creation. 4 years of data collection, model refinement, and incident response had gone into building a defense that could adapt faster than the threat itself. Brooke, for all her leadership skills, couldn't explain the inner workings of those detection models any more than she could reverse engineer an asymmetric cryptographic handshake. Does Rachel even have a clue what they're going to scrutinize? Pete asked, his tone halfway between concern and disbelief. I shook my head slowly. Rachel thinks cybersecurity is just the next marketing buzzword. She's never had to respond to a zero-day exploit or roll back a network at 3 a.m. with a 4-star general breathing down her neck. The truth was, Rachel saw modernization as a matter of optics, change the faces, update the slide decks, and the perception of innovation would follow. But the reality of defense contracting was written in the fine print of federal regulations and the unforgiving logic of national security. In this world, progress didn't just mean new ideas. It meant knowing which systems would actually survive under fire, and which leaders had the scars to prove it. Let's start with the numbers. User interfaces, adoption rates, and all the metrics that typically drive our internal decision-making. The renewal was a formality. Everyone signed off without a second thought. But the real test was coming up fast, and we all sensed trouble brewing beneath the surface. Monday, June 3rd brought the storm we'd been dreading. At precisely 8:15 a.m., Alex Turner appeared at my office door, looking like he'd spent the entire weekend in the trenches with nothing but stale coffee and a mountain of malfunctioning code for company. Andrew, we've got a serious problem with the Pentagon presentation, he said, pulling the door shut behind him. He looked exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from trying to patch things that should never have broken in the first place. Brooke asked me to prep the technical slides, but now she's ordered the whole deck rewritten for a general audience. She wants everything watered down. I felt a familiar knot in my stomach. What does simplified mean exactly? Even as I asked, I knew I wouldn't like the answer. Alex opened his laptop and pulled up Brooke's revised slides. Every diagram, every technical detail we'd worked so hard to clarify was gone, replaced by glossy stock images of server racks and sanitized sound bites. The intricate architecture diagrams had been swapped out for vague slogans like enhanced threat detection and next-generation security solutions. It was marketing fluff, empty promises, no substance. Brooke's rationale was that Pentagon evaluators weren't interested in how the system worked, only what it could do for them. Outcomes, not mechanisms, she'd said. Alex's frustration was palpable. She wants us to focus on strategic value and operational results, but she stripped away everything that actually proves we can deliver. I scrolled through the slides, growing more concerned with each page. The technical review we'd prepared had been gutted, replaced by the kind of pitch you might use to woo Silicon Valley investors. It was all vision and no grounding, an approach that might work in a boardroom but would be disastrous in a defense review. I knew from experience the Pentagon's technical evaluators wouldn't tolerate this kind of hand-waving. If we went in unprepared, they'd see right through us, and they wouldn't hesitate to call us out. Alex, you know these systems as well as anyone. What are we supposed to say if they start asking about NIST 853 compliance? I asked, my voice edged with anxiety. That's not something you can gloss over. Brooke, meanwhile, kept tossing around fashionable terms like seamless integration and plug-and-play deployment. She seemed oblivious to the realities of government cybersecurity. Military networks are nothing like the commercial cloud environments she was used to. Every component requires rigorous security certifications, penetration testing, and exhaustive layers of approvals. There's no such thing as plug and play when you're talking about classified infrastructure. It's a world defined by protocol, oversight, and technical scrutiny. That morning, Alex and I sat down and mapped out the disaster Brooke was about to walk into. Pentagon technical reviews aren't sales meetings, they're interrogations. The room is filled with career experts, people who've been dealing with cyber threats since before most of us had our first email accounts. General Morrison, the lead evaluator, is a legend, a West Point PhD in computer science, 15 years commanding cyber warfare units, and a reputation for asking the questions nobody else dares. He doesn't care about marketing jargon. He wants to see proof, actual architecture diagrams, detection algorithms, compliance matrices. He expects you to know your system down to the last line of code. Time moved quickly. June 18th arrived, and the atmosphere was tense. I watched Rachel, Brooke, and Brian load up their presentation materials into a black SUV, headed for Pentagon City. Rachel was dressed immaculately in a navy Armani suit, an outfit that probably cost more than some of the staff's annual bonuses. Brooke looked polished, carrying a designer portfolio that screamed confidence, but I could tell it was a mask. The whole team looked like they were headed to a tech demo, not the cross-examination of their careers. By late morning, the call came. At 11:47, my phone rang, and Brian's voice came through, tight with fear. "Andrew, get to the Pentagon, now. We've got a situation." My pulse jumped. What happened? What kind of situation? Brian's answer was terse. "Just get here. Bring every technical document you've got on the threat analysis platform. Everything." It took me less than an hour to reach them. The scene in the Pentagon conference room was grim. Rachel, usually composed, was pacing anxiously, her jacket discarded and hair a mess from running her hands through it. Brooke was motionless, eyes glued to her laptop, as if willing it to produce the answers she didn't have. Norman was on speakerphone with Colonel Stevens from DoD Procurement, and even through the encrypted line, the tension was unmistakable. I didn't need to ask what had happened, but I did anyway. "What's going on?" Rachel turned to me, looking defeated. "There were issues. The DoD wants specifics, real technical details about our platform's capabilities." I pressed for more. "What kind of issues?" Brian stepped in. Brooke couldn't answer their questions about the system architecture. General Morrison grilled her about machine learning threat classification, but she just kept repeating high-level concepts about AI and automation. She never got into the nuts and bolts, the actual methods. Now they want everything: specs, diagrams, code samples, proof that we can do what we promised in the proposal. Rachel nodded grimly. "They're demanding comprehensive documentation. They want to see that our platform isn't just vaporware." Suddenly, Colonel Stevens' voice cut through the conference speaker. "Meridian Defense has 72 hours to deliver full technical documentation on your cybersecurity platform. If you fail to comply, your contract will be subject to immediate review." Everyone in the room knew what that meant. "Pentagon speak for we're one step away from canceling your deal." Norman cleared his throat, urgency in his voice. "Andrew, we need a complete documentation package, system architecture, compliance evidence, everything the DoD needs to verify our platform meets federal standards." I looked at the team, Rachel unable to meet my gaze. Brooke fixated on her laptop, Brian nervously scrolling through his phone. I could see the realization dawning in their faces. The time for buzzwords and business school bravado was over. What mattered now was substance. Deep, unambiguous technical proof that our solution could actually defend the networks we'd been entrusted to protect. We had 72 hours to turn marketing promises into engineering reality, or risk losing everything we'd spent years building. "I'll need full system access and admin privileges," I told them, laying out my conditions with no room for negotiation. "Source code, classified documents, every last byte, all of it authorized and above board." Rachel didn't even blink. Her poker face was impressive, but I saw the tension in her jaw. "Whatever you need," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the slightest flicker of desperation. "But I have to present the documentation myself. The DoD won't accept answers from someone who can't field basic network security questions." For a split second, I watched as her composure wavered. The narrative she'd so carefully woven, of visionary leadership, of a company reborn under her guidance, threatened to unravel right in front of her. All the buzzwords and leadership seminars couldn't prepare her for this moment. If I ended up saving the Pentagon contract, the entire company would finally see where the real backbone of our cybersecurity operations came from. Not from the dazzling all-hands presentations or the slick new hires, but from the quiet, methodical work that actually kept us on the government's shortlist. "Agreed," she said after a moment, her voice barely audible, as if conceding more than just the contract. "Just save the contract, Andrew." I nodded, already setting the gears in motion. But if I'm being honest, I had no intention of saving anything, at least not for them. I wanted to make a point. One that had been building for months as I watched real expertise sacrificed on the altar of new perspectives and fresh ideas. The Pentagon was about to get a lesson most companies never learned, until it was too late. You can't fake competence, not when national security is on the line. That Thursday night, I stayed at the office long after everyone else had gone home. The place was silent, the only light coming from the monitor in my office as I sifted through 8 years' worth of technical documentation. Every algorithm I'd designed, every system I'd architected, every protocol I'd carefully crafted to keep federal networks secure. I gathered it all, meticulously organized and backed up to encrypted drives. I didn't do it to save the contract. I did it to make sure that when I walked out, I'd have leverage. Too many times I'd seen people like me get pushed aside, their work taken for granted, their legacy erased. Not this time. My exit would be on my terms. Friday dawned with the kind of manufactured urgency you only see in corporate crises. Rachel called an emergency all hands, the kind where everyone pretends not to know why they're there even though the grapevine had been humming since sunrise. Departments crowded together: cybersecurity, finance, legal, operations, even the board. Rachel stood at the front of the room, her posture rigid, her movements deliberate, as if one misstep would trigger disaster. Yesterday's Pentagon evaluation revealed some communication opportunities, she began, her gaze carefully avoiding Brooke, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. We're implementing immediate process improvements to ensure superior technical delivery. Translation. Brooke fumbled, and now we're in damage control mode. Andrew Hoffman will be leading our technical documentation response to DoD, Rachel continued, her voice carrying a hint of both relief and resignation. His comprehensive knowledge of our platform will demonstrate why Meridian Defense remains an essential partner in cybersecurity. I stood, feeling every eye in the room shift to me. Some looked relieved, others wary, and a few already seemed to be recalculating their own positions. The room was thick with unspoken questions. Was I the savior or the scapegoat? What would this mean for the pecking order? Before I prepare anything for DoD, I said, keeping my tone neutral, I need clarification about my employment status. Rachel's smile wavered, just for a second. What do you mean, Andrew? Yesterday you asked me to rescue a $34 million contract. 3 weeks ago, you told the board I was being moved to an advisory role. So am I still VP of Cybersecurity Operations? Or am I just the guy you call when the house is on fire? The silence that followed was palpable. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. Norman Price, always the consummate politician, pretended to scroll through emails. The question hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Andrew, this isn't the time for organizational discussions, Rachel said, her voice tight, the facade starting to crack. It's actually the perfect time, I replied, holding her gaze. The DoD explicitly requested technical documentation from senior cybersecurity leadership. If that's not me anymore, someone else needs to step up. No one needed an explanation. Brooke couldn't even define a firewall, let alone defend our architecture to the Pentagon. Brian Walsh was sharp when it came to business systems, but his skills were a decade out of date for real-world security. Deep down, everyone in that room knew I was the only one who could go toe-to-toe with government auditors and come out unscathed. Rachel's mind was racing. I could see it in the way her fingers tapped against her notepad. She shot a pleading look at her father, William Montgomery, founder of Meridian Defense and a man who'd seen 100 government contracts live and die on the strength of technical credibility. We're developing a new position, Rachel said, desperation barely hidden. Chief Technical Officer for Government Relations. Enhanced compensation, direct access to the board, full autonomy over federal contracts. The offer was familiar, a shiny new title, some extra perks, but none of the authority that actually mattered. It was a classic move. Acknowledge my value just enough to keep me on the hook, but not so much that I could challenge her control. But she'd just opened the door I'd been waiting for. I appreciate the consideration, I said, letting the silence that followed do the heavy lifting. And in that pause, I could feel the room shifting. People were starting to realize this wasn't just about the DoD contract or a job title. It was about the soul of the company, about whether real expertise would finally get the recognition it deserved, or if we'd keep pretending that leadership alone was enough to keep us off the front page of the news. For the first time, I could see doubt flicker in Rachel's eyes. She was starting to understand that you can't market your way out of a technical crisis. And as I looked around at my colleagues, the ones who'd been overlooked, the ones who knew what it took to keep our systems running, I felt a quiet sense of resolve. Whatever happened next, Meridian Defense would be forced to reckon with the cost of sidelining the very people who kept its promises, and I would make sure of it. Before I agreed to any adjustments in my role, I made it clear I needed to consult with legal. The stakes were simply too high for anything less. Key personnel rules and federal compliance weren't just bureaucratic hurdles. They were the foundation on which Meridian's entire defense business rested. I'd spent weeks wading through dense legalese, highlighting every clause that had my name attached, and I could tell Norman had been doing the same. The way he snapped his head up from his laptop, you'd think I'd caught him reading my private emails. Andrew, maybe we should have this conversation in private, he suggested. a note of caution in his voice that told me he already suspected the direction things were headed. "No need for secrecy," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "It's a simple question. If my job status changes, what happens to our DoD contracts?" The room erupted in a wave of murmurs, board members turning to each other with worried glances. Rachel's complexion went from confident to ashen in a heartbeat. She was realizing too late that her plan to sideline me was about to backfire. Norman, always the analyst, cut through the chaos by focusing on the facts. "What are the federal contract implications here?" he asked, his voice steady. He cleared his throat and read directly from his screen, no doubt quoting the same contract language that had been keeping me up at night. "Current DoD agreements specify Andrew Hoffman as key personnel for all classified operations under FR 52-2191. Any change to his employment status obligates us to notify the Department of Defense at least 180 days in advance and submit to a formal capability review." Margaret Chen, ever the voice of reason, leaned forward. "How long does a capability review usually take?" Norman didn't sugarcoat it. "At least 120 days. But if the DoD is unconvinced about our continuity plan, it could stretch to 6 or even 9 months. A heavy silence settled over the room. 9 months without contract renewals wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Meridian Defense's revenue stream ran straight from those government contracts. Any interruption would put the company in free fall. Rachel's eyes flickered with panic as she realized the trap she'd walked into. Remove me from my position, and the company would be forced to jump through months of regulatory hoops, risking the lifeblood of our business. Keep me, and her talk of transformational leadership would be exposed as little more than a smokescreen. "There has to be some way around this," Rachel stammered, her voice trembling. "Some way to transfer responsibilities without triggering a federal review." "There is," I replied coolly. "Don't change my employment status." William Montgomery, the longest-tenured board member, leaned in. His gaze was sharp, appraising. "Andrew, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," I said, letting the silence linger. "I'm just stating the facts. The Department of Defense cares about one thing: continuity of qualified, cleared personnel. They're not interested in our internal reshuffling, only in the assurance that the right people are in place and the mission gets done." I looked each board member in the eye. "If leadership wants to reorganize, that's your prerogative. But we cannot jeopardize our federal contract obligations in the process." The board dissolved into anxious side conversations, calculators flashing in their heads as they tallied the cost of a prolonged DoD review. Rachel stood frozen, realizing her maneuvering had backfired spectacularly. Margaret Chen, always pragmatic, spoke first. "I think we need to pause any restructuring plans and focus on protecting the DoD contract." "Agreed," William said, his tone making it clear the matter was settled. "Andrew, can you manage the Pentagon documentation?" "Absolutely," I replied. "I designed the core systems they'll be reviewing. I know exactly what they're looking for." As the meeting ended and the board members filed out, Rachel lingered behind. She cornered me by the window, her desperation barely concealed. "Andrew, we have to work together. The company's future hinges on this contract." I nodded, not unkindly. "You're right. The company's future does depend on the contract." What I didn't say was that I'd already mapped out that future, and Rachel wasn't part of it. The next 72 hours were a blur. I assembled and cross-referenced every technical document, every line of source code, every compliance matrix. The Pentagon wanted evidence of our capability, so I gave them more than they requested. 847 pages of detailed technical specs, secure architecture diagrams, and exhaustive protocol explanations, all meticulously mapped to every relevant security standard. By Monday morning at 900, Colonel Stevens had the whole package on his desk as promised. By 3 p.m., the DoD sent confirmation. Our contract would remain in good standing pending their standard review. Colonel Stevens personally called Norman. "Outstanding technical package," he said. "This is the level of detail we need for classified systems." His praise was rare, and it sent a visible wave of relief through the senior team. That evening, Rachel hosted a champagne toast in the conference room, all smiles and congratulations. She was already rehearsing a new pitch for the board, eager to reframe herself as the architect of Meridian's ongoing success. What she didn't realize was that while she celebrated, I'd been setting my own plans in motion. Tuesday morning, I called in sick for the first time in years. Instead of driving to Meridian, I headed downtown to K Street, the heart of the capital's defense industry. My destination, the offices of Patriot Systems Corporation. a direct competitor with an eye on the same DoD contracts we'd just secured. Their cyber division occupied 8 sleek, glass-walled floors near DuPont's Circle, a testament to both ambition and deep government ties. Anthony Rodriguez met me in the lobby. He was a former Marine colonel, all crisp discipline and disarming candor, a man who knew the inner workings of the Pentagon and the subtleties of federal contracting better than most. We'd first crossed paths years earlier, when he was vetting vendors for Cyber Command, and there was mutual respect even then. As we walked past the security desk and into a quiet corner office, I could feel the weight of what was about to happen. For years, I'd built Meridian's defense systems from the ground up, navigating red tape, securing clearances, and earning the trust of people like Colonel Stevens. But now, with Rachel's power plays and the board's wavering confidence, it was time to consider what my expertise was truly worth on the open market. Patriot Systems was hungry for the kind of technical depth and contract continuity that I represented. Anthony wasted no time. Andrew, we know your reputation. We've followed your work at Meridian. If you're interested in a new challenge and the opportunity to shape the direction of our next generation of classified systems, we should talk. He didn't have to say more. The implications were clear. In this world, knowledge and trust were currency. If I chose to move, the impact on Meridian would be seismic, not just for the company, but for every contract, every program, and every person who depended on my clearance and expertise. As we sat down to negotiate, I realized I held more cards than I'd ever imagined. Rachel's schemes had forced my hand, but in doing so, she'd also revealed just how indispensable I'd become. The future of Meridian, and perhaps even the next chapter of my own career, would be decided not in a boardroom, but in this quiet, glass-walled office on K Street. Andrew, I've got to admit, I'm surprised you finally called me back, Anthony said, standing behind his desk with that panoramic view across the PTOAC, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city skyline like a statement of intent. The office itself was an understated flex, original Rothko on one wall, a credenza that probably cost more than my car, and the quiet hum of a staff that didn't dare interrupt. Honestly, the timing tells me Meridian's got some leadership issues. Things change, I said, settling into a chair that looked more like a minimalist sculpture than anything meant to be sat in. The leather was butter soft, the kind of detail that telegraphed, "We close deals here." I let myself appreciate it for a moment. No shame. "So, what do you actually know about what's going on over there?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, but my curiosity dialed all the way up. Anthony's answer was just a slow, knowing grin. That look meant he was already a few moves ahead. He'd heard all about Rachel Montgomery's grand plans, how she'd swept in from the world of startups convinced she could disrupt defense contracting with catchphrases and TED Talk slides. But here, in the government sector, reputation is currency and relationships are gold. News traveled faster than even the best encryption. Everyone knew Rachel was struggling to get traction, her culture transformation running up against the brick wall of federal compliance and legacy systems. For the next 90 minutes, we dug into Patriot's ambitions. Their board wanted to muscle into the cybersecurity market, to stand shoulder to shoulder with Meridian and the other major defense players. But ambition wasn't enough. Patriot had cash and a rock-solid balance sheet, but they were green. No reputation in cyber, no engineers with clearances, no executive with the credibility to walk into a Pentagon meeting and be taken seriously. They needed someone who could bridge technical depth and government trust, someone who could walk both worlds. "What would it take to bring you in?" Anthony asked, not wasting a second on small talk. I'd already built my list. I didn't need to hesitate. Senior Director of Cybersecurity Operations. Full authority over the technical team and direct say in all contract relationships. I'm bringing Alex Turner plus 2 more engineers. They're non-negotiable. Salary $240,000 base, with performance bonuses tied to contract wins. Standard federal contractor benefits. And I want a clear path to executive leadership, no glass ceilings. Anthony nodded as if he'd expected every word. "Done. When can you make the jump?" "I need 3 weeks. I'll do this by the book, full notice, proper transition. With federal contracts, key personnel changes aren't something you just slip past the government." What I didn't say, and what Anthony probably already guessed, was that those compliance rules weren't just red tape. They were about to become Meridian's existential crisis. Wednesday morning, I drafted my resignation. I sent it directly to Norman Price, Meridian's general counsel, The only person who'd truly understand the bomb I was dropping. Not to Rachel, who was still busy workshopping her latest vision statement. Not to HR, who would just route it to legal anyway. The email was clinical. 3 weeks notice, final day July 17th, career advancement. But the attachment was the real payload. A formal notification to the DoD Andrew Hoffman, designated key personnel for contracts M202147, M22223, M22231, and M22431, terminating employment July 17, 2024. Anyone who's done time in federal contracting knows what that means. When a designated key person walks, the feds don't just shrug it off. Every affected contract gets yanked into a mandatory review. The government freezes all new business, no fresh deals, no contract modifications, no renewals, until they're satisfied the company can still deliver. For a company like Meridian, where 80% of revenue depended on that pipeline, it was a slow-motion implosion. By 10:34 a.m., the first call started. Norman's phone lit up like a Christmas tree. DoD procurement officers, program managers, auditors. Everybody wanted to know how Meridian planned to keep its promises without its cybersecurity lead. Rachel, blindsided, had no answers. For months, she'd tried to trade hard-won technical expertise for buzzwords, hiring consultants, investing in agile transformation, and eliminating what she called legacy thinking. But when the feds asked who was actually running their classified systems, all the jargon in the world couldn't cover the gap. By noon, the executive team was in crisis mode. Rachel called my cell 17 times in a span of 4 hours. I let every call go to voicemail. Brian Walsh, the COO, tried to go around me, calling Alex Turner for intel. Alex, loyal to the end, told him I wasn't available. The silence was its own kind of message. By Thursday, word had reached the board. William Montgomery, Rachel's father and still chairman in all but name, demanded an emergency meeting. They wanted explanations. Why their most critical employee was walking, how it would affect contracts worth hundreds of millions. Rachel scrambled to assemble a plan, but there wasn't one. Meridian's entire government cyber portfolio was suddenly balanced on a knife edge. That afternoon, I spent hours packing my office, sorting through years of documentation, and running transition briefings with the engineers who'd be left behind. Alex Turner looked pale, like he'd just been told the servers were on fire. "Andrew, what happens to us?" he asked, voice low. "Half these systems need your codes for updates." "Write everything down," I told him, "and start updating your resume." I could see the weight of it hitting him. All those late nights and compliance headaches. Suddenly at risk because leadership hadn't bothered to understand what held the place together. Friday afternoon, I was in the parking garage loading up the last boxes when Rachel found me. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Eyes red, hair pulled back in a way that said she'd stopped caring about appearances. The desperation in her voice was a shock. "Andrew, please, we can fix this. Whatever you want. Money, title, equity, a board seat. Just tell me." Standing there, in the echoing concrete stillness of the garage, I realized she finally understood. This wasn't about perks or titles or even money. It was about respect, the kind you can't buy with a retention bonus. 6 months ago, you decided I was dead weight, just legacy thinking you could replace with a consulting deck, I said, looking her in the eye. Turns out I was the one holding the place together. The reality was brutal. DoD wouldn't rush their review, 6 to 9 months minimum before Meridian could win new business or renew existing contracts. The cash would keep flowing for a while, but the future had just been put on ice. For a company built on the steady heartbeat of government money, it was a death spiral. Clients would get nervous, competitors would pounce, and talent would start to bleed out. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in Patriot's new war room. Whiteboards covered in strategy, engineers sketching out systems architecture, Anthony mapping out our next move. The news broke. Patriot Systems had landed a series of major DoD cybersecurity contracts. Meridian's pipeline dried up. Their best people started taking calls from recruiters, and Rachel's transformation strategy was nothing but a footnote in a cautionary tale. The lesson was clear. In this business, relationships and expertise still matter more than buzzwords. And when you let those walk out the door, there's no amount of innovation that can save you. Former Meridian clients grew increasingly anxious about the possibility of service disruptions, as those exhaustive Department of Defense reviews dragged on far longer than anyone had anticipated. The uncertainty made them nervous. Nobody wanted their critical operations to hinge on a company stuck in bureaucratic limbo. As a result, Clients started diversifying their portfolios, quietly shifting segments of their business to competitors just to safeguard themselves against potential outages. They'd seen enough failed government contractors to know that loyalty only went so far when mission deadlines were on the line. Meanwhile, the internal fallout was equally swift. Alex Turner, one of our sharpest senior systems engineers, didn't hesitate to make his move. Barely 2 weeks after my own departure, he accepted a senior role at Patriot, Meridian's longtime rival. That single defection opened the floodgates. By September, the exodus was in full swing. Half of my former team had joined Alex at Patriot, drawn by the promise of stability and leadership that seemed in short supply at Meridian. The talent drain was obvious to anyone paying attention. It was more than just a loss of headcount. We were losing the people who carried years of project history, institutional memory, and the nuanced understanding of how to navigate the labyrinthine world of federal contracts. Rachel, ever the loyalist, held out longer than most. She stayed on until the October board meeting, perhaps hoping that a turnaround was still possible. But when the quarterly numbers came in showing a brutal 43% plunge in revenues, and the Pentagon announced that the capability review would drag on through at least the second quarter of 2025, even Rachel had to face reality. The writing was on the wall. The board, no longer willing to gamble on a leadership team out of its depth, finally intervened. They terminated the CEO and brought in an interim leader with genuine expertise in government contracting, someone who understood the intricacies of procurement cycles, compliance protocols, and the unforgiving pace at which federal clients move when confidence falters. Some might look at the sequence of events and say I got my revenge, that my departure set off a chain reaction. Personally, I see it less as vengeance and more as a textbook example of a market correction. Companies often underestimate the value of institutional knowledge, the unspoken, hard-won experience that can't be captured in quarterly reports or dressed up with buzzwords about disruption and innovation. These aren't assets you can simply list on a balance sheet or substitute with flashy consultants. Whenever leadership forgets that, the market eventually serves up a harsh reminder. For Rachel and the board, that wake-up call was costly, both in terms of lost revenue and the immense effort required to rebuild trust with clients and employees. But that's the nature of real learning in business. It's never cheap and it's never easy. The lessons that stick the hardest are always those that come with a price.